She had grown accustomed to being looked through. In 28 years of service, Dorothy Vane had learned that there was a particular quality to the gaze of a person of rank when it passed over someone like her. Not hostility, exactly. Not contempt, exactly. Something closer to the way one's eyes moved across the pattern of a wallpaper, registering texture and color without registering a thing. She was part of the house. She was its floors and its plaster. She was. In the taxonomy that mattered in such places, the scullery woman, and the scullery woman was no one. So when the new Duke of Corvin crossed the threshold of his great hall on the afternoon of the 12th of November, in the year 1815, Dorothy did not raise her eyes. She was on her knees beside the hearth, with a brush in her hand, working at a stain in the stone that had resisted her for 3 mornings running. The hall was full of commotion, the household arranging itself into the careful formations that a duke's arrival required, footmen and housemaids and the butler, Mr. Frawler. Crane, at the head of the line with his shoulders set at their most formal angle, Dorothy kept her brush moving. She heard the doors. She heard boots on the stone. She heard Mr. Sinka. Crane's welcome, the practiced sentences of it, and the Duke's reply, which was brief. Then the boots stopped. They stopped close enough that she could see them at the edge of her vision, dark and new and still. She did not look up. She pressed her brush a little harder against the stone. The hall had gone quieter in a way that was different from ordinary quiet, and her pulse had gone a little faster in a way she could not account for, and she kept her eyes on the stain. "Who's that?" the Duke asked. His voice was low and level. She did not know it. She had never heard it, not once in 28 years, and yet something in her chest responded to it the way a tuning fork responds to its proper note, not with pleasure but with recognition, a vibration she did not want and could not stop. "That is merely the scullery woman, Your Grace," said Lady Constance, from somewhere to the Duke's left, her own voice carrying its habitual tone of mild instruction, the tone one used for explaining the organization of furniture. "You needn't trouble yourself." The boots did not move. Dorothy set her brush down. She did not know why. She had not decided to. Her hand simply set the brush down on the hearthstone, and then, with a slowness that felt inexorable, she raised her face. He was looking at her. The Duke of Corvin was 28 years old, and he had his father's jaw, and his father's dark eyes, and his father's way of going utterly still when something had startled him into attention. Dorothy Vane looked at him across the great hall of the house where she had spent 6 years scrubbing its floors, and she pressed her lips together, and she did not make a sound. He was searching her face. She looked away first. She picked up her brush. Her hands had gone to trembling, which she would not permit anyone to see. Margaret Vane had been 16 years old when she married Thomas Ashmore in a country church on a Tuesday morning in October, with 2 witnesses who were sworn to silence and a vicar who had reason to be grateful to Thomas's father and who asked no inconvenient questions. Thomas was 19. He was the second son of the Duke of Corvin's household, which meant he had a modest income and no particular expectations, which meant he was free to marry as he chose so long as he did it quietly, and he had chosen to marry Margaret Vane, because Margaret Vane had laughed at something he said in a garden and then corrected his argument in the next breath. And he had decided on the spot that he could not be happy without her. She had loved him without reservation or caution. She had loved him with everything she had, which was considerable, because Margaret Vane at 16 was already a person of serious weight, a girl whose mind ran along careful lines and whose heart, when it finally gave itself entire. He was dead 11 months later. The riding accident happened in April when she was 7 months pregnant and staying at his family's estate, at his insistence so that she would be comfortable. She had been reading in the morning room when the horse came back without its rider. She remembered the sound of it. She did not even now let herself remember the sound of it often. What followed was swift and cold in the way that old families could be swift and cold, when a problem presented itself that required management. Lady Constance Ashmore, Thomas's aunt, who had managed the family since the Duke's illness had confined him to his rooms, had not approved of the marriage and had not known of it, and when she learned of it, she moved with precision. The marriage certificate was a private matter, she said. The child's legitimacy was a matter to be settled through channels she controlled. Margaret, she said, was a girl of no fortune and no family of consequence. Her presence would only complicate things. There was money offered. There was a threat contained within the offer, framed as legal complexity, as potential ruin for Margaret's father's modest reputation, as the long arm of an old family's patience. Margaret was 16 years old, and 3 weeks delivered of a son she had held twice before Lady Constance's arrangements removed him from the room, and she was so broken by grief and by birth and by the particular exhaustion of a young person discovering that the world she had believed in did not exist, that she took the money. She signed what was put before her. She left. She had been leaving ever since, in one form or another. She had found work. She had lost it. Through illness, through the particular misfortune that seemed to attend a woman with no people behind her, through the sorrow that would settle on her sometimes, for weeks at a time, and make her unreliable in the small ways that employers noticed. She had worked her way through a succession of houses, each one more modest than the last, until she was here, in the scullery of Corvan Hall, the great house itself, which she had found her way to 6 years ago, through a combination of desperation and a compulsion she did not fully understand. She had told herself she only wanted to know he was alive. She had told herself it would be enough to be near the house where he had been raised, to know that the same stone walls surrounded him, that the same gardens he played in were the ones she could see from the scullery window, if she stood on her toes. She had never intended to see him. She had believed he would not come. The Duke had been in London, she understood, or abroad. The house had been Lady Constance's domain. She had not accounted for the old Duke's death last spring, and its consequence. If you have stayed with this story this far, you may find yourself thinking that this is not the sort of tale you expected. It is not. Stay with it a little longer. What is coming has been 28 years in its preparation. The Duke's name was William, and he had grown up believing his mother died in childbirth. It was the only story he had ever been told, and he had never thought to question it until the year he turned 25, when he was going through his dead father's papers and found a leather satchel that had been closed for a quarter of a century, sealed with a strip of wax that had gone the color of old bone. Inside was a miniature portrait, oval, no larger than his palm. A girl of perhaps 16 or 17, painted in the style of the previous generation, with gray-green eyes and dark auburn hair, and a mouth that had been set in a firm line when the painter caught it, as though she had been interrupted in the middle of something serious. There was a note in his father's hand written in the months before the accident, the handwriting still clear and young. "Margaret," it said, "my wife, our child. Find her, if I cannot." William had sat for a long time with the miniature in his hand and the note open on the table before him. He had held his mother's face in his palm, and understood that he had been told a lie so fundamental that everything he knew about himself was constructed on it, and he had made a decision that night that he would not make a noise about it. Not yet. He would find her first. He had sent inquiries, quietly, through channels that did not require him to explain himself. Margaret Vane, minor gentleman's family, the county of Somerset, disappeared from record sometime around 1800. The inquiries turned up very little. The family had sold their small property. The father had died. The woman herself had vanished into the quiet darkness that swallowed women of no fortune who had no one to look after them. He had almost given up. Then he had come to Corvan Hall for the first time in 4 years to take possession of the estate and settle the business of the inheritance. And he had crossed the threshold of his great hall, and a woman on her knees beside the hearth had raised her face at the wrong moment, and the face was the one in the miniature. Older, worn through with years he had not been there for. Her hair was dark, auburn threaded heavily with silver, and there were lines at the corners of her gray-green eyes that the miniature's painter had not lived to capture. She was wearing a gray wool dress, with a white linen apron over it, and her hands were red from work, and she was, by the evidence of everything around her, the scullery woman. And she was, by the evidence of his father's note and the set of her mouth, and the particular quality of her eyes as she looked at him across 28 years of silence. His mother. He said nothing. That first day, he was not ready. He needed to be certain, and he needed to think. And he needed Lady Constance to believe that he had noticed nothing. He was a patient man. His father had made him patient, through absence. Dorothy spent the following week moving through her work with the same steady regularity she had practiced for years. But the regularity had a crack in it now, a fine fracture running through the center of every hour. She heard things. Servants in a great house always hear things, floating down through the social architecture. And what she heard was the same thing, spoken in several voices across several days, that the Duke had been asking after a Margaret Vane. Not loudly. Not officially. A quiet word to the solicitor. A question put to the oldest footman. A name. Hers, spoken in the kitchen passage where it settled over her like cold water. She understood immediately that she had made a terrible miscalculation in coming here. She had believed she could be invisible. She had believed that invisibility was her natural state, that 28 years had worn her smooth enough that no one would look at her and see a woman with a history. She had been wrong. She went on washing the pots. There was nothing else to do. The evening of the 14th of November, she was working in the kitchen passage at 9:30, when she heard footsteps behind her. She did not turn. She had a small book open on the wooden counter beside her, a collection of verse she had saved for 20 years by moving it from house to house, wrapped in a square of oilcloth, and she had been reading aloud from it, in a low voice, to the kitchen boy. James. Hal. Who was 10 years old and could not yet read, and who had formed the habit of sitting on the step beside her at the end of the evening, and listening to whatever she had to say. James was asleep on the step already, his head fallen sideways against the wall, but she went on reading anyway, softly, because the stopping felt wrong. She read 2 more lines. The footsteps did not continue past the passage. They stopped. She did not turn. She finished the verse, a spare 12 lines about winter and the persistence of small things. And it had always seemed to her that poetry understood something about endurance that prose could not quite reach. She closed the book and set her hand on the boy's shoulder and said quietly that it was time to go up. He stirred and rose and shuffled toward the servants' stairs without fully waking, the candle flame guttering briefly in the small draught his movement made. She watched him go with the particular warmth she had always felt toward children who trusted without needing to be asked. She picked up her book and turned. The Duke of Corvan stood at the end of the passage with a glass of water in his hand, and his dark eyes entirely still. He was not in his formal dinner dress. He had come down in his shirt sleeves, which meant he had come down informally, which meant he had not expected to encounter anyone, or had not cared whether he did. He had been standing there for some time, she thought. His posture had the quality of a man who had made himself quiet on purpose, not because he had arrived quietly, but because he had stopped his own motion and held it there. He had not, she realized, come down for the water. Or he had come down for the water, and he had found something else. She did not move. He did not move. The candle in the bracket behind her was the only light in the passage, and it showed her his face at an angle, the jaw and the line of his brow. And his face showed her something she recognized from long ago, something that had lived in Thomas's face in the mornings before he was fully armored for the day. An openness, a willingness to be present in a way that rank usually sealed away. His hand went to the breast pocket of his coat, a gesture she did not then understand. "Good night, Your Grace," she said, and went up the back stairs. Her legs were steady on the steps. Her hands were not. She lay awake for a long time in the narrow bed in the room. She shared with 2 other scullery maids, and she pressed her fingers against the forget-me-not brooch, under her nightgown, the small enameled copy she had had made in Bristol 2 weeks before she left Corvan Hall the first time, 28 years ago, when she had still been Margaret Vane. Lady Constance summoned her 2 days later. Not to the drawing room? That would have implied a social register that Dorothy did not occupy. to the small room off the library that had been Lady Constance's private domain for 40 years, where she kept her correspondence and her account books, and the particular atmosphere of authority that she had long ago learned to maintain as a form of protection. She was seated behind the writing table when Dorothy entered, and she looked at Dorothy with pale blue eyes that had not softened in the 28 years since Dorothy had last stood in front of them. She had not changed. That was the thing. She was older, certainly, her white hair more architectural, her gown darker. She carried her fan, as she always had, at a precise angle, a slight upward cant that communicated both readiness and command. She had always reminded Dorothy of a mechanism, something that ran on certainty, as a clock runs on springs. "You have been in my house for 6 years," Lady Constance said without preamble, "under a false name." Dorothy had been using the name Hobbs when she applied for the position, not her own name. She had known better than to use her own name. "I am told," Lady Constance continued, "the scullery maid was seen near the portrait gallery again, loitering near the frames. You have been observed near the gallery on no fewer than 4 occasions. This is not appropriate behavior for a woman in your position." "No, my lady," Dorothy said. "You will leave this house tonight," Lady Constance said. "You will take whatever belongings you can carry, and you will not return. If you do not comply, I will have you removed by whatever legal instrument the situation requires. You entered this household under false pretenses. That is sufficient." Dorothy looked at her. The room was warm from its fireplace, Lady Constance's private fire, which was always kept higher than the house fires in the servants' passages. The writing table had a lamp on it, and the lamp's light caught the jet beadwork on Lady Constance's gown and threw small points of brightness across the carpet. It was the sort of room designed to communicate authority through its appointments, the good chair behind the table and the lesser chair before it, the neat stacks of correspondence, the ledger open at a page that could be referred to at any moment as evidence of how much was being managed here. Dorothy had stood in such rooms before. The chair one was not offered, the lamp angled away from one's own face. She thought about all the sentences she could say, sentences she had been not saying for 28 years, sentences that had worn themselves smooth inside her through years of constant handling, rubbed to a kind of brightness like stones in a riverbed, bright from motion, sharp from nothing. She thought about the portrait gallery where she had stood 4 times looking up at the painting of Thomas at 21, the only likeness that existed of him in the world as far as she knew. She thought about James asleep on the step. "Yes, my lady," she said. She did not cry. She had learned early that tears cost more than she could afford. In the scullery she packed what she owned into a canvas bundle that fit under one arm. It was not much. The book of verse, wrapped in its oilcloth, a change of linen, the wages she had saved and kept in a small tin box, a pair of gloves nearly through at the fingers. She touched the brooch at her collar. She left it where it was. Hobbs, the housekeeper, found her in the scullery passage. She was a woman of 60-odd years, with the sort of face that had always told the truth about itself, and she stood in the doorway with a lantern, and looked at Dorothy with an expression that said she understood something was very wrong, and did not know what could be done about it. "You don't have to go tonight," Mrs. Hobbs said. "It is November. You cannot walk out in November with 1 arm's worth of belongings." "I rather think I can," Dorothy said. She had walked into worse. She did not say morning. Mrs. Hobbs pressed her lips together. She set her lantern on the counter and put her hands on Dorothy's shoulders for a moment, briefly, the way a mother might. And it was the closest thing Dorothy had received to that gesture in a very long time, and she did not flinch from it though it cost her. "Where will you go?" Dorothy did not answer, because she did not know. She lifted her bundle and walked toward the servants' entrance, at the back of the hall, through the passage that ran behind the kitchens, and out toward the rear courtyard. The dinner in the great hall had begun 2 hours ago. Lord Fenwick and 3 other guests arrived from the county for what was to be the first formal dinner of the new Duke's tenure, the candles lit and the table laid, and the social machinery of the house assembling itself for the first time under a new hand. She passed the corridor that opened onto the great hall's anteroom. She stopped. But she stood at the corner of the passage with her bundle under her arm, and the sounds of the dinner drifting through the corridor, the low conversation, the clink of glass, and she could not have explained even to herself what made her stop. She had always been a woman who knew when to leave. 28 years had made her expert in the art of it. Lord Edward Fenwick appeared at the end of the corridor. He had stepped out, apparently. For the same reason anyone steps out of a dinner room for a moment's quiet. He was a man of 50, broad-faced and steady, who had been the neighboring landowner to Corvin Hall for as long as Dorothy had been in the county, and he had spoken to her twice in 6 years, once to ask her the way to the kitchen garden, and once, more recently, to ask her name. He had seemed genuinely interested in her answer, which had been unusual enough that she remembered it. He saw her. He saw the bundle under her arm. Miss Vane, he said. He had remembered her name. She stopped walking. Where are you going? He said. He had a quality she had come to recognize in the time she had spent in his vicinity, a directness that was not unkindness, a habit of saying the thing he meant without ornament. Away, she said. It is November, so Mrs. Hobbs has observed. She was very tired. She was tired in a way that went beyond the tiredness of the body, a tiredness of long standing, the kind that settles into the marrow. She looked at Lord Fenwick in the dim light of the corridor, and she thought that he had kind eyes and that she was very sorry she would not be staying long enough to know him better. You should not have to leave, he said, very simply, the way one states a fact. Something in her chest shifted at the plainness of it. She stood at the corner for one moment longer. Then she turned. She walked down the corridor toward the great hall's anteroom. She did not think, or she thought only one thing, which was that she had spent 28 years choosing absence, and every time she had chosen it, she had believed it was for someone else's benefit, and every time it had cost her something she could not get back. And she was 44 years old, and she had one small bundle to her name, and the dinner of the Duke of Corvin was going on behind that door, and she had a brooch pinned inside her collar. That was the only thing she had left of the day she had been briefly worth something to the world. She opened the anteroom door. She walked into the great hall. It went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something has entered that does not belong. The table was laid for 12, candles burning in their candelabra, the faces of the Corvin family's guests arranged around the long mahogany surface, each one turning now toward the woman in the gray work dress and white linen apron standing in the doorway with a canvas bundle under her arm. Miss Arabella Harwood, beside Lady Constance's seat, put down her fork. "Good Lord," Miss Arabella said in the tone she reserved for things that had inconvenienced her. "The scullery maid has apparently lost her way." Dorothy walked to the table. She set down her bundle. She reached into her collar. The brooch came free with a small metallic sound, the pin drawing back, and she set it on the polished surface of the table at the center, in the space between the candelabra, where the light caught it. 6 small enameled petals. Forget-me-not blue with a center of pale gold, a copy of the one Lady Constance had taken from her in this same house, 28 years ago in a room upstairs. She did not look at Lady Constance. She looked at William. He had gone very still. His hand had gone to the breast pocket of his coat. The same gesture she had noticed in the kitchen passage, and now she understood what lived in that pocket. He drew it out slowly. The miniature lay on his palm, small and oval, and he looked down at it, and he looked up at her face, and he looked down at the brooch on the table. The room was holding its breath. He stood. He stood up from his place at the head of the table, and he crossed the length of the great hall in 3 strides, and he stopped before her, and his face was no longer the composed face he wore in public. It was something much older than that, something she recognized from the portrait gallery. From the face of a man at 21 who had loved without reservation and whose love had been taken from him. Lady Constance had risen. "William, sit down. This woman is a servant. She has no business in this room." "That woman is my mother," William said. 6 words. His voice was level. It was not loud. It did not need to be loud. He said it clearly and without hesitation, and he said it in front of 12 witnesses at a dinner table with the candles burning, and he pointed at her. Not because she needed pointing at, but because the pointing was its own sentence, irrevocable. A thing that could not be unsaid in a room full of people who would carry it into the county and the season and the drawing rooms of London before the week was out. Lady Constance sat down. The color had left her face. Her fan was still in her hand, but it was not at its angle. She looked for the first time in Dorothy's memory like someone whose machinery had stopped. Miss Arabella Harwood said nothing. She was looking at the brooch on the table. Lord Fenwick stood in the doorway. Dorothy did not move for a moment. She was not certain she was capable of movement. She was standing in the great hall of the house where her son had grown up without her, and her son was standing 3 feet away from her with his father's eyes. And she was holding herself upright with the same discipline she had used to hold herself upright for 28 years, which was considerable, which was all she had. William held out his hand, not a gesture of performance. A simple, direct thing, palm up, as though he were offering to help her over a threshold. She looked at his hand. She thought of his father, who had had the same gesture, the same quiet directness in the body, the same way of offering without demanding. She took his hand. The warmth of it was almost more than she could manage. She had not been touched by someone who intended to keep her in a very long time. "Come and sit down," he said. He said it quietly, not to the room, but to her. "You must eat something." She almost laughed. She pressed her lips together. She said, "Yes. All right." William looked up then, across the table at the 12 faces arranged around it, and he said, in a tone that was conversational and absolute, "I shall require 2 additional solicitors from London by Friday morning. My father's first marriage certificate is to be authenticated by whatever legal process the matter requires." He looked at Lady Constance. "We will discuss the rest privately." Lady Constance said nothing. She had always known that the moment she could not control would arrive eventually. She had simply not known when. Mrs. Hobbs appeared in the doorway behind Lord Fenwick, lantern still in hand, and looked at the scene in the great hall with an expression of quiet satisfaction. In the weeks that followed, the account of what had happened in the Corvin Hall dining room on the 15th of November traveled through the county with the particular velocity of a story that satisfies something people had not known they were hungry for. The solicitors came from London, as the Duke had requested. The marriage certificate was found where Lady Constance had kept it, in a locked drawer in her private room off the library, which she surrendered with the silence of a woman who had spent 40 years protecting a wrong that had grown too heavy to carry, and was perhaps not entirely sorry to be relieved of it. The legal processes were not swift. They were thorough. Dorothy did not leave Corvin Hall. She had been offered rooms in the East Wing, her son's instruction, and she had accepted them with a formality that made William look at her for a moment, as though he wanted to say something and did not yet know how. They were learning the language of each other, the 2 of them, which was a slow process, and sometimes a painful one. 28 years of absence to be accounted for. 28 years of a boy becoming a man in a house she had been kept out of. She told him about Thomas. She had not spoken of Thomas to another person in more than a quarter of a century, and the words came out in the wrong order sometimes, and sometimes she had to stop. William listened. He had a way of sitting very still when someone was speaking that she recognized from the kitchen passage, from the night he had stood with the water glass and said nothing. He had his father's patience. She was glad of it. Lord Fenwick called at the house in the 2nd week of December, on a Tuesday morning when the frost had come down overnight and the grounds were pale with it. He was shown to the morning room where Dorothy happened to be going through a small box of correspondence she had kept since her years in Bristol, sorting what could be let go and what could not. She had not expected a caller. He stood in the doorway, with his hat in his hands, and asked if she had time to walk on the grounds. She looked at him. She looked at the box of correspondence. She thought about November, and the corridor, and the 6 words that had been said in front of 12 witnesses. "You should not have to leave," he had said, very simply, the way one states a fact. "The ground will be cold," she said. "I have noticed," he said, "that you are not a woman who is deterred by cold." She set down the letter she had been holding. She found her shawl. The grounds of Corvin Hall in December had a particular quality of quiet. The brown grass stiffened with frost, the stone walls of the estate throwing long, thin shadows in the low winter light. They walked at a proper distance, she and Lord Fenwick, which was the correct thing to do, though the distance seemed a courtesy more than a barrier, a space that acknowledged something might eventually cross it, rather than asserting that nothing could. He talked about his own estate, his late wife, in a brief passage that was tender without being raw, 7 years softening the edges of it, the work he had found in those 7 years to keep himself occupied. She listened, and when he paused, she told him about Bristol, about the house in Bath where she had stayed the longest, 3 years, before the mistress of it died, and the household dissolved. Small things, the accumulation of a life. "You did not complain," he observed. "Complaining changes very little," she said. "It changes the person one is complaining to," he said. "It communicates that something matters." She considered this. The frost crunched under her boots. A blackbird called from the yew hedge at the garden's edge. 2 sharp notes, and then quiet. "I was told quite early," she said, "that my perspective on what mattered was not the relevant one. You were told incorrectly." She looked at him. He was looking at the grounds ahead of them, his broad face composed, and she thought that she could say something now, some small provisional thing, and he would hear it without making more of it than she intended. He had that quality. "I believe I am beginning to understand that," she said. He nodded. They walked on. William was at the library window when they came back across the grounds, and he watched them with an expression that was difficult to read, though Dorothy thought she caught, beneath the surface of it, something that might have been relief. He had worried about her, she understood. He had been worrying about her for 3 weeks, in the careful way he did everything, methodically and without display. She went in through the east wing entrance and found the rooms that were now hers, the fire laid and burning, the curtains drawn against the December cold. On the mantelpiece, where she had set it that first morning, the forget-me-not brooch caught the firelight. 6 small enameled petals copied from the original by a jeweler in Bristol who had asked no questions, worn inside her collar for 28 years against the day she could not have said she was waiting for. She stood at the mantelpiece and looked at it for a moment. Then she lifted it and pinned it to her gown, outside her collar, where it could be seen. The legal confirmation arrived from London on a Saturday in January. Margaret Vane Ashmore, wife of Thomas Ashmore, son of the 6th Duke of Corvin. Her son was the 8th Duke. The 7th had been his grandfather, who had died the previous spring. The 8th Duke of Corvin had a mother, and the world had been informed of this in the proper form, in the proper legal instrument, in the proper order. Dorothy sat in the morning room with the document in her hands, and she read it twice, and then she set it on the table. Mrs. Hobbs brought her tea, which was not strictly Mrs. Hobbs' role, and sat down across from her, which was less strictly proper still. And they drank their tea in companionable silence in the winter morning. "Well," Mrs. Hobbs said after a while. "Yes," Dorothy said. Outside the morning room window, the grounds of Corvin Hall lay under their January quiet, the stone walls and the bare trees, and the garden paths she had walked as a scullery woman for 6 years, and would now walk as something else, as herself, as the person she had been before she learned to be invisible. Lord Fenwick had called 3 times in December, and once already in January. He had asked her on the last occasion whether she might accompany him to the assembly in the county town, when the season allowed for it, in the spring. If she was willing, she had said she would think about it. She had thought about it. William came in with the papers from the solicitors' meeting, and he sat down across from her and handed her the documents she needed to sign, and she signed them, and he looked at her while she signed and said, with a quietness that she was coming to know as his truest register, "Are you well?" "I am beginning to be," she said. He nodded. He looked at the forget-me-not brooch at her collar, which he had seen on the dining table, and which he had later asked her about, and which she had explained as well as she could in the language of facts, the original, the copy. 28 years. He had listened with the water-glass stillness and had not said much. He had later, without comment, produced the original from his own coat pocket and set it on the table between them two brooches. The same 6 petals. She had picked them both up and held them in her palm. The copy was on her gown now. The original was on the mantelpiece in her rooms. She had set them on opposite ends of it, as bookends, as though the 44 years her life contained could stand between them, as though the whole of it could be held. William stood. He paused at the door. "Lord Fenwick," he said carefully, "is a decent man." She looked at him over the rim of her teacup. "I have heard," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. It was the smallest possible expression of amusement, but she had been watching his face for 3 weeks by now, and she knew it, and she filed it away against the growing catalog of things she was learning to know about him. That he was patient in the way his father had been patient. That he went very still when he was moved by something. That he had a dry wit he kept under considerable discipline. That he worried that he was sometimes lonely in the particular way of people who have been told what they are and have only recently been permitted to wonder if the telling was entirely accurate. She knew these things about him. She was learning them every day. She had 28 years to account for and a lifetime ahead in which to do the accounting, and she intended to use it. The January light came through the morning room window and fell across the table, across the signed documents, across her hands resting in her lap, across the teacup and the fire's last warmth and the quiet of a house that was, finally, in some sense she had not yet found the words for hers. She thought about the assembly in the spring. She thought about Lord Fenwick's kind brown eyes, and his habit of saying the thing he meant. She thought about 28 years of choosing absence, and the particular quality of the air in a room when one has finally chosen to stay. If you have been with this story from the beginning, you know what it cost. Leave a word below, if you will, for what Dorothy carried all those years. And stay with us, if you are willing, for the stories still to come. She picked up her teacup. The forget-me-not brooch caught the light. She had been found.